Welcome back to The Conservative. Hi there, I'm Mike Lannon, your host, and this is going to be a wickedly fast half hour, as they say in Massachusetts. They like using that word, wicked. So we will discuss a number of different things in the 30 minutes that we get here, and see if we can't make some headway with your thinking. And of course, you know this is a conservative view on the way I look at the world and the way a lot of other people look at the world. And I wanted to start today's show by just talking very quickly about a couple of things that have happened since last show. One is the breaking news today of the representative from Texas somehow deciding that he should out fundraising donors of the Trump campaign, and so he's let the world know of 44 major donors to Trump, especially Texans. And then he has very quickly associated those 44 with the most recent mass shootings, the one in El Paso that they left is trying to blame Trump for, and the one in Ohio that the left would like to blame Trump for, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But the outing of donors is a major political faux pas. It's not appropriate, especially when the social media now goes ahead and takes down one of the other breaking news stories of Mitch McConnell's protest at his house over the last few days, where those protests with foul language were videotaped and put on one of the social media accounts, and then immediately taken down by the hierarchy of the social media accounts. And most people don't even realize that Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're run by owners who have a very strong left-leaning socialistic view. And so therefore, the First Amendment is going to be attacked, and free speech promised by the First Amendment of the Constitution is under tremendous suppression by the left that own the media that is now the media of most folks' choice. And therefore, without them even realizing it, there is going to become a regulation, and which is too bad, because free speech should not be regulated, but at the same time, it should not be regulated by those who are trying to run it. But we have been subjected to that by television. We've been subjected to that by the newspaper industry, and we know that many people of the media mogul set, the elite media, refuses to present to you both sides of the story. So most of the time when you're listening to the radio, you're reading a newspaper, listening to the radio, as I just mentioned, or watching television, or now looking even at the major pieces of the internet. You are listening primarily to far left to left to far left, I guess we would say, but it's certainly not the middle of America's thought, and it's certainly not being presented of any people that have a thought to the right conservative side. That's why I've stuck with this show as many years as I've had, because I'm probably one of the lone voices on a public television station that will at least stand up and give you as much of the view from the right side of things, and I mean right side, than the left will. So talking about those kinds of things, you have to be very, very discerning on what you're listening to, because the public is being pumped full of misinformation. When I was a young man studying civics in high school, which they don't even bother to teach anymore, there was a big unit that we had to study and prepare reports on called propaganda. And a piece of that propaganda is to take and make you believe only that which they want you to believe. And good newspapers, good papers that have editorial pages present both sides. They have an editorial page that will present the left. They'll have an editorial article that presents the right. Therefore, years ago, the newspaper was considered one of the best places to get news because it presented both sides, and then you could have your argument in public on which side you took, and you could have that argument and perhaps come to an exploration of some of the impasses. No one is ever going to be completely convinced to the right from someone's left position or someone from the left being completely convinced of the position on the right. But we should try to build a common ground, a shared meaning. We should be able to stay focused long enough to pay attention to that particular attention and not have it thrown out into Zelensky's rules and the 13 principles that are set there to vilify and tear apart the opposition, which they do so very, very well. And we should not be doing that to each other, but we do. And people wonder why we have such a divide. It gets to the point where you can't even talk to neighbors who have a completely different view because they have learned to scream and yell. And if I learn to scream and yell, no one's listening, okay? So those of you who think that somehow or another by yelling and screaming and calling someone a name and doing all this other stuff is going to cause people to listen to your opinion, you need to go back to the textbooks on psychology and philosophy and find out that those people that wrote philosophies and wrote psychological profiles and pieces on how the brain works will know that a loud, yelling mouth is not going to allow the brain to calmly assimilate the information that's being thrown at it and accommodate it and use it. It's going to go into the brain, short-term memory, muddled around and thrown back out and discarded and not thought of. And then later, that particular person that's been doing this yelling and screaming is not going to be listened to very carefully. So this outing of the donors, there will be a big price to be paid there. People that are interested in what's going on in America and are a piece of the deplorables, a piece of the anti-Americans, the piece who are tearing apart the Constitution. In other words, those folks who believe in Donald Trump, despite all of his characteristic flaws, they're going to continue to build strongly, and the Dems are going to find that they are in deeper trouble than they've ever been in at the poll in 2020. And the media will try to convince everybody that Trump is behind, that Trump is losing. And that's not, from this particular opinion, is not happening. I talked to enough people during the course of my day, both here in Vermont and also around the world, and in particular the northeast sector of this country, to tell you that his base is growing and that there are more and more people that support him than don't support him. Certainly the majority of the people are not really supporting the far left view of socialism. So this media mess will eventually be straightened out. There's going to be somewhere along the line that's going to have enough money to buy a large competitive media, and they'll give Fox News a run for its money, and they'll give all the rest of the media a run for the money. It's very interesting to notice that the #1 news station in America, I suspect maybe even in the world, although CNN is well entrenched in the world because it's in all the airports, but Fox News from about 3 o'clock in the afternoon until about 11 o'clock at night is the #1 station looked at by the majority of people watching television. Now, what happens on the internet, I'm not quite sure. I do find it very interesting that over the last 3 weeks, I've had a YouTube unsubscribed come up on my computer screen saying YouTube News. The newest way to get the news is YouTube News. I've declined to subscribe because I know that YouTube right now is not an unbiased ownership. It's owned by a young, left-leaning socialist. And so therefore, I'm not interested in watching YouTube news. I will continue to get my news from, well, I do watch CNN and MSNBC, but mostly from Fox News. And I read a ton. Most of my education comes from reading. Hopefully yours does too, because that's the best way to inform yourself, because you can listen to someone, but you can reread and rethink what a book tells you, or what a magazine or a newspaper article tells you. You can look back through it and say, whereas once someone speaks like I'm talking to you right now, unless you're recording this, you're going to have to stop and think and say, what did he say and what did he mean? And so much of what is spoken about on a television is taken out of context and turned and spun by the left. That's part of Zelensky's rules, to actually do that to a person, so that the person is perceived by the rest of the world as not a good being. So those kinds of things you have to be concerned about and be watching for all the time. It's interesting because during this short period since the latest two mass shootings, and I should stop right there and I'll come back to what Vice President Biden was saying the other day in a major speech that was against Trump and Trump's, all the left's attempt to make Trump the villain for the things that he says about immigration and what he and how he sees and views America. We certainly didn't say anything about the poor things that Mr. Obama said, and there were many. And we didn't say the things that Mr. Clinton said, and there were many. And that's what I mean by the spin. So it's interesting to note that the gentleman, refused to mention any of their names, the gentleman that did the mass shootings in Dayton, Ohio, according to his website and his social media posts, he is very much in favor politically of Elizabeth Warren and of Bernie Sanders, and in particular Elizabeth Warren. So I haven't heard a ton on the news about her involvement in the Dayton shootings. And it's ludicrous for someone to sit, like myself, and to say, well, she's to blame for the things she says, or that Bernie's to blame for the things he says, and that causes some guy to pick up a rifle or a knife or poison or whatever they decide that they're going to use to make a name for themselves and to promote their issue, and to blame it on a politician is ludicrous, just not good thinking. But the gentleman in El Paso, believe it or not, on his website are anti-Trump dissertations, but the media hasn't told you any of that stuff. They haven't told you anything about Elizabeth Warren. They haven't told you anything about these two nut jobs and their political views, because all they want to do is to say it's totally Trump's fault, and it's not. I mean, any human being with any kind of real reasoning knows that the President of the United States does not cause people to pick up a gun and go shoot people, nor does Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or Joe Capone, you know, whoever is a politician. They're not doing this kind of stuff. And we as Americans would take that particular politician down in a hurry if we thought that they were actually advocating and paying for and promoting murder of citizens. No, that's not happening, and we should be smart enough to stop the nonsense. But as long as people want to keep screaming and yelling and using Zelensky's rules to vilify the opposition and to tear them down and to make them look like they're the bad guys, the divide in this country will continue to spread. It will continue to grow, and we're going to find more and more people not in the middle, and more people taking sides. to the point where it will become revolutionary. Now, will it become revolutionary in the sense that it was in 1775? Will it become revolutionary as it was in the 1860s when we had America's most deadly war called the Civil War? Don't know that. Certainly there is and are people in this country that are not the normal people that are arming themselves, because there's lots of Americans that have guns because the Second Amendment protects us from having folks who are anti the person living in the home or anti-me from having a gun. So they can have a gun and shoot me, but I can't have a gun to shoot back. That's basically that position of Second Amendment, which comes way back from when the British were trying to take our guns away so that we couldn't shoot at them and they could shoot at us. And they did. And that was one of the reasons that the British were marching to Concord. And they were looking for our stash of arms. And if they could have gotten their hands on them, they would have taken them. And so we decided that wasn't going to happen. And thus the beginning of the American Revolution that led to the greatest nation that has ever existed. So those kinds of things you have to read in great detail to understand why they're there and why most Americans are not going to ever give up on the Second Amendment. Now, the folks on the left, the people that want to destroy this country, all we have to do is read carefully the history of socialism and what they do in order to grab their power, which is all it's all about, so that the elite run the government, and you have no power, no say. That's where the left is would like to take us, and that's what they're working on right now with the newest 2020 election. The majority of the folks that are running on the left that are getting any kind of attraction, top 4 for sure, all the rest have less than 3% of any kind of a vote or knowledge. Political stunt, for instance, the outing of the 44 donors by Joaquin Castro, the brother of the Julian Castro that has got less than 1% of the polling vote right now for his campaign to be president. Most of you probably never heard of either one of these two guys, and yet they become famous because they out these 44 donors. We are not going to be able to come back and allow the left to continue to do this, and that's the big divide. The people on the right are going to eventually say, no, we're not going to allow this to happen, and that's why you get this tremendous pushback, and that's why Donald Trump is so popular, is that he's speaking for a ton of people in this country who are sick to death of the fact that the left has gone as far as they have and figure that they can get away with it, and that's a big problem. In America, the left gets away with a lot of things that no other country, no other government would allow to have happen, and that was what Thomas Jefferson warned us about. He and Ben Franklin were telling us that if we could keep this republic, we would be lucky, because it's the first time that a government by men and women has been ever allowed to occur. Even Great Britain today has a queen with a structure underneath a parliament that doesn't run anywhere near like what the United States government and the Constitution of the United States runs. It's completely unique, and so most folks have no clue when they think that they need to listen to a liberal professor in college who trains their young minds to take the country down, which is exactly what Nikita Khrushchev said he would do. It would take time, but the Soviet Union premier basically said that's what they would do, and they had already started. And if you look at the school system in America today, you can tell that that is exactly what's going on, because we don't teach civics anymore. We don't teach American democracy. We don't teach the things that would allow our young folks to grow up and understand what this country was all about. For instance, history. We had a gentleman just recently come under the attack of the left, the Saul Alinsky rules thrown right at him to tear him down because he dared to post a picture of white men and women from Appalachia that were very, very poor, trying to make the point that in America there haven't been just individual races or individual ethnic groups or individual religious groups that have been totally persecuted, that it's been fair across the board, and that everybody that came to America as an immigrant, including those who came as slaves, which nobody ever wants to talk about, the Irish slaves, and the Irish slaves and the Negro slaves and the things that they did against both them and forced them to do, hidden history. Nobody wants to talk about that when they talk about reparations. But this gentleman from our community who dared to post and went under the brutal left slaying with no knowledge about white privilege. And white privilege comes from World War I, when it was American women, and in particular one American woman who was involved in a social movement, socialistic movement, and coined the phrase because she felt that women weren't being privileged enough and that white men were suppressing her group. And the first time that that word white privilege was ever used was written and used at one of the colleges in Boston. I can't remember exactly which one it was, but that was the first time it was used. It was never anything to do with what is being intellectually stolen and used for today. And people don't realize that. In other words, they didn't make up this word white privilege for something that they're now doing. They copped it and pulled it over into their movement, and nobody even bothers to go and find these things out. Well, those kinds of things come from reading, come from finding out what actually is the history behind certain actions and certain words, etc. It's much deeper than these folks want you to believe. It's all on this surface stuff, and they get you all riled up, and they know that you're not going to be much more than the frog in the pan. They know this. There's no question that I've said this over and over again about the frog in the pan. And you keep that fire lit, you let it simmer and simmer and simmer. By the time it's hot enough, the frog hasn't got enough energy to get out of the pan, and therefore he dies. So same thing with you and I if we don't get off our duffers and find out really what's happening. Yes, it takes time, and yes, we're very busy, and no, we don't want to be involved, and no, we don't want to have to take the time out, but we better be thinking about doing it in order to protect our own liberties and protect ourselves from what is potentially coming. So Mr. Biden yesterday, or during the course of this show, and made a major speech against President Trump, and I loved listening to it because I couldn't believe my ears when Mr. Biden is talking about how great the Democratic Party is and how they were very supportive of non-bigotry movements. And I stopped and I thought, I know some history here. Andrew Jackson, Democrat, believed in slavery. Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, segregated the United States armed services. In other words, the Army and the Navy, and he did that, Democrat. Up until that time, we fought side by side, all Americans together. And it was a Democrat that did that segregation. Internment camps. Gee, that would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, another Democrat. Gee, let's see, good friend of Biden's, guy named Harry Byrd, Ku Klux Klan, good friend of Teddy Kennedy, Harry Byrd. George Wallace. Now, Biden mentioned George Wallace, and I was like, You got to be kidding me. Here's a guy that worked with him. Wallace was one of the Southerners who stood up and believed that blacks should never have the right to go to school with whites. He was an anti-segregationist. He was shot. Somebody tried to assassinate him. That's how tough his voices were. But people don't even remember who he was. People don't even know that he existed. And yet, in a speech, we'll tear down Donald Trump by using folks who other folks have no clue about and know nothing about their history. That's just like saying that Teddy Kennedy was a great senator. No, he wasn't. Bill Clinton was a great president. No, he wasn't. They're all human beings. They all make mistakes. They all had their own internal demons. And yet, if they were on the left, they got away with it. That's my point. They got away with it on the left. On the right, oh no. Don't you dare make a mistake. Don't you dare open your mouth, because if you do, you're whatever name they want to call you. And that's what's going on in the country today. And I'm telling you, as I sit here right now, I'm old enough to know that as long as that rhetoric continues, and there is no opportunity to build a shared meaning and to explore impasses and to use your own self-awareness as an appropriate resource, to pay attention to what actually is the intention on the table, to be able to balance your thinking with inquiry about what they're thinking, to try to come to a common ground. As long as that divide continues to grow, there will be no solidarity in this country. And it's a simple statement, but it's not an easy solution. You have to be willing to come to the table and stop the nonsense, the political nonsense about power. It's not about power, and people have got to stop thinking about that. It's not about them, no matter what party, right or left, running our country. It's about them being a representative of us. We're supposed to be running the country. We, Americans, you and I, we're supposed to be running the country. That's what makes us different than any other political system in the world today. We, Americans, are the people. We have a constitution that says we will run the country. So as long as we keep sending, whether it be to the right or to the left politically, to Washington, D.C., and or to the legislature here in Vermont and or to our own city governments, people who are on their own private agenda and could care less about the entire majority of the people that are sending them there, we will continue to have this divide. And when a person is elected, they don't get elected to elect only the people that voted for them. They get elected to represent all of the people, whether they voted for them or not. So when you get elected, you're supposed to take into consideration the opposition's view. You're supposed to be thinking about, well, what did the opposition do? In our local area, it's pretty much a popularity contest. It's pretty much a contest of whose name is most familiar to the majority of the voters. In the nation, it could be the same. In the state, it could be the same, but it gets a little bit changed because you have to have some positions at the state and at the national level that a voice that people are willing to listen to. But bottom line is that as long as people go to represent only that of their own personal agenda and only go to represent who they believe sent them there and never take into consideration the folks that did not vote for them, we will continue to have that divide, and it will continue to be a tough division to cross back over to. So the great politicians are the ones who can, quote, cross the aisle. And that is what crossing the aisle means, is to be able to listen to and compromise with the opposition. No one person has the complete knowledge base necessary to make the good decision for America, for Vermont, and or for the city. It just doesn't. It takes a lot of us working together for the good of everybody, not just a few people. So if we continue to vilify, continue to destroy the personalities and characteristics of the people that are trying to be helpful, we will indeed wind up divided at a greater division rate than we are today. Well, my half hour is gone. How fast was that? Thanks a lot for listening. See you next time. Bye now.